Welcome to part 2 of 3D racing in Gdevelop. Now before we start this tutorial, of course this is part 2, so if you haven't watched part 1, make sure to go watch that. I'll have a card in the top right corner of my video, or you can go to my channel and watch that quickly. But this tutorial is directly built off of part 1, so you need to make sure you watch that first. Now, getting into the actual code of this video, the first thing we're going to do before we even start adding some new things is we're actually going to make some quick optimizations to the code that make the code a little bit more flexible. Now the first thing is you'll see that changing the Z position of this camera, which is changing the height of it, because when it comes to 3D, when we're changing the Z position, we're changing the height. We have this at a set value, which is 175. But in this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to make the player fall and rise back up using a spring. So therefore we can't have the camera as set value. We need it adaptable. And currently you can see that if you click in the player's Z position is 100, and the camera Z position is currently set to 175. It's hard to see it here, but we know in our code it's 175. So what we're going to do here is set the camera's Z position to always be 75 more units than the player's Z position. So that's how we're going to do it. So we're going to go into the Z position, and if we want to add this, we're going to put player.y, not player.y, player.z, because this accesses the Z position of the player, and then we're going to put plus 75. So no matter what, the camera's Z position will always be at 75 more units than the player's. Of course, we can preview it, but nothing's going to change because right now we have not programmed falling off of platforms and things of that manner. But another thing we're going to program in this tutorial is we have it so our car, it can move and it accelerates forward, but a problem is when you stop, the car immediately stops. And we know that when it comes to racing and when it comes to real life, cars don't immediately stop when you stop holding the accelerator. They don't immediately stop. They slowly come to a halt. So we're going to want to program that. But another thing we're going to do is I'm going to set the distance to be a little bit farther. And you can see we're setting it at negative 150 here. I'm going to set the camera distance around the player to be negative 200, just so we can see the player a little bit better and see more around the player. So I can see this is much better. We can actually see the player more. So this is cool. Now we need to add the code that changes the player's movement to actually match a decelerating. We don't want to instantly stop anymore. So we're going to need to change quite a few things. Not too many things, but we're going to need to change quite a few things. Now, normally we have it so our player, it only moves when the W key moves. And we don't want it for this case. Now, it's going to be a little confusing at first. I'm actually going to get rid of this code where it says is W key pressed. But the player is always going to have speed added to itself. But we're going to change the formula in which we do it. Now, of course, we're going to keep the acceleration variable up here. And I'm going to change the starting speed value at the beginning of the scene. We're going to change this speed to be equal to 0. Basically, our player will only start moving when the speed value goes up. And you'll see that our player, when W key is pressed, it sets speed to player variable, of course, the accelerated variable. That's fine. But also, when W key is not pressed, you'll see that speed is set equal to 350. But we don't want that. When W key is not pressed, we want this player speed to start going down until it reaches 0. So how are we going to do this? Now, when W key is not pressed, we're going to go into double click into the event, and we're going to put speed. Of course, we're trying to change the speed variable, and now we want to subtract a value. Now, we want to decelerate at the same rate we're accelerating. Of course, you could technically make another variable so you can decelerate at a different rate, but for our case, and just for the sake of simplicity, we're going to keep the acceleration and deceleration variable exactly the same. So we want to subtract a value from the speed, and what we want to subtract from speed is the acceleration variable. So I'm going to put player dot variable acceleration, accel. And we can actually we don't have to put player dot variable anymore because of Gdevelop's new features. We can just simply put player dot accel, and that will access the variable here. So if I preview this, we're going to run into a problem, but I'm going to now you'll see that we're starting to go backwards. And the reason why we're going backwards is because we never set a limit to when the player cannot accelerate. Because we don't want to be moving backwards by default. I can see we're moving all the way off, and we're not even falling, which is something we're going to do in this tutorial. But basically, we need to set two limits. First of all, we need to clamp the player's value of speed to never be under 0. So we're going to use clamping, a technique called clamping, which is very common in game design. And clamping, all clamping does is limit a value from a minimum and maximum value. It can't go over the maximum, and it can't go under the minimum. So we're actually going to do this. So we're going to have no condition here because we want this to always apply. and I'm going to add an action. We want to access the speed variable, so I'm going to go to player, and then I'm going to type in variable to find the speed variable. We want to change the number variable, speed, and we want to set it equal to, and this is how you use clamp. Whenever you want to limit a value between two values, a minimum and a maximum, you want to put clamp, and you'll see the parameters right here. You have the value first, and then you have the minimum and maximum. So the first parameter we want is the value, and of course the value that we want is player.speed. We want to access the speed of the player. Player.speed, that's our first value. And to make a new parameter, you want to put comma and then space, and you'll have the next parameter, which is the minimum value. The minimum value that we want here is 0. And then we type another comma, and then we have a maximum value. And the maximum value, I'm just going to set this to 1 million, so I'm going to just put 1 and then 6 zeros. And here we have it. We have the minimum and the maximum value. I'm going to preview and see if anything changes. You'll see that our car is not moving at all. When we stop, it slowly comes to a halt. And it can be a little bit hard to tell because of the ground, but if you pay attention to the ground, you can tell that we're slowly coming to a halt and not instantly coming to a halt. Now, another thing, technically we've already fixed the problem, but a thing I like to add just in case, I'm going to put an and condition and put and if the player's acceleration, if the player's speed is not equal to 0 when W key is not pressed, just to make sure. Now, other conditions, I'm going to put events and control flow, and we want to check not only if the W key is pressed, but and if the player's speed is not equal to 0. So I'm going to put player, I'm going to type in variable to find the speed, number variable, speed, and I'm going to put if it's not equal to 0. And of course, everything is going to stay exactly the same. We've now fixed the acceleration and deceleration problem that we have here. So now we slowly come to a halt instead of just instantly stopping. So that's already way more realistic. So I'm going to save my project quickly. And now we want to actually get into the falling. Now falling is going to be the most complicated part of this tutorial, but it's not too complicated because we're using top down. But of course we know that when we're dealing with top down 3D games, falling is always kind of more complicated than it is when you're using a different method that I showed in another video. But I found a great method that is actually extremely good and extremely valuable for controlling the height. Now, the way that we're going to do this, let me explain it first so we're not confused. The way that we're going to control the height is we're going to have a 2D object. And this 2D object is going to be moving up and down, depending on the actions of the player. And basically, we're going to make the Z position of the player match the Y position of that object to simulate realistic movement. Because normally when you try to kind of change the Z positions of objects to control the height, it can be pretty choppy and really hard to get like a good formula for it. But we're going to be simulating it with a 2D object. Now the first thing we need to do is create, of course, a 2D object. So I'm going to add a new object to the scene. It's going to be a sprite. It doesn't really matter what it looks like because the player's not going to be able to see it in the game. And I'm going to call this fall simulator because that's what it's doing. We're going to be simulating the fall of the player using a 2D object. So I'm going to name this fall simulator. And I'm going to import an image, and I can just import this blue cube right here. It doesn't matter if this is the same as the player because we're not going to see it. And it does need one behavior. We're going to use a platformer object behavior. So I'm going to add a behavior, and we're going to use a platform character. And the reason that we're using a platform character is because the platform character falls, and it falls realistically and not choppy. So that's why we're using a platform character. Technically, you could also use a physics object for this, but I prefer using platform character. They're much simpler. Now I'm going to turn the default controls off because we don't want to be able to even move this at all because of platform object. And the max falling speed, everything else can basically stay the same. It doesn't really matter because this object won't even be touching any other objects. So I'm going to hit apply. And I'm going to, one thing I do, we want to go back into the fall simulator. And you'll see that maximum falling speed is 700. We want to start this off as 0 because remember, we're going to be making the Z position, which controls the height of the player, match the Y position of this fall simulator. So if it starts off falling, that means our player is going to start off falling. So I'm going to set it as 0 as default. And I'm going to actually drag this onto the scene, and you'll already see that as invisible. We're dealing with an invisible object, so I can't even see my camera. Now, a few things we want to do is if you can't find an object, and this is pretty common in Gdevelop when you put an object under a layer, you want to click this tab right here with the 3 bars and the little diamond on the side, and this is called the instances panel. And in the instances panel, you can see all of the objects that you have in Gdevelop, and you can access them. And of course, the one that we want to access is the fall simulator. So I'm going to click the fall simulator. And if I zoom up to it, you'll see that it's under this ground. In order for us to have this over the ground, I'm going to actually add a layer. And this layer is going to be called 2D, because this 2D objects, which is only one in this case, is going to be on this layer. And we're placing it over the base layer. So that means any object that we put in this layer automatically, no matter what the Z order is, will be over any object on the base layer. So now make sure you click into the fall simulator, and then you click the layer, and then you set it to 2D. And now you should be able to see that it's over the ground now. So the size doesn't matter too much. It doesn't matter what size you set this to. I just like it kind of bigger so I can see it. So now we have the object, and of course you will not be able to see this on the scene. So now we want to actually start doing the controls with the fall simulator, because the fall simulator is very, very, very important. So let's get started with the fall simulator. So I'm going to go back into the events, and I'm going to click on this camera controls first, the group, and then I'm going to put Shift A to create an event below it. I'm going to right click into this condition and add an event group. And this event group is going to be called player falling. Everything in this event group will be related to the player falling. And this is a great way to organize code. Now there's a few things that we want to add. First, we want to actually make the synchronization between the Y position of the player and the Z position, well, the Z position of the player and the Y position of the fall simulator. So we want to start off with an always condition. And the always condition, you don't have to put anything there, just leave it blank. And the first thing we want to do is add an action, and we want to change the Z position. I'm going to click into player, and I'm going to type Z. And we want to change the Z position, and you should see Z elevation. And we want to be set to always, at all times, we want to be set to fall simulator.y. And put parentheses. And if I put preview, you'll see that nothing has happened right now. Nothing in the least has happened. And there's a few reasons why nothing has happened. Well, first of all, we have our Y. Let me set this Y position of the player to equal to the same one as the Z position of the player. The Y position of the fall simulator will be equal to 100. And let me preview. And you'll see that everything is exactly the same right now. And that's because we haven't set any code to actually start falling. So what if I set some code to start falling? So I'm going to click into fall simulator, and I'm going to click into behavior, and let's just set the max falling speed back to 700 and see what happens. I'm going to put preview, and you'll see that we start floating in the air. Now this is already an issue. You'd be like, why are we floating in the air instead of falling? Shouldn't we be falling? And the reason why we're not falling is because, remember, in Gdevelop, if you move the Y position of an object downwards, the Y position goes up. But when it comes to a 3D object, if you move a 3D object, if the value goes up for a 3D object in terms of the Z, the player actually goes up. But for a Y value for a 2D object, when you move the Y value up, the player actually goes down. And that's kind of awkward. Gdevelop is one of the only engines I've ever seen do this, but it's just something you have to kind of get used to. So the way that we're going to fix this problem is we're going to always set the Z position of the player to be equal to the negative value of fall simulator. The negative value, I just realized I misspelled that here, but it doesn't matter. We'll just use that misspelled name for now. We're going to use the negative value of fall simulator. So I'm going to hit preview. And even though we're falling to the ground right now, at least we're actually falling like we want to. So here we have it. We're going to get rid of this. And I'm going to put fall simulator. We're going to put back to behaviors. And we're going to set the max falling speed to start off as 0. Going to hit apply. And now we're going to go back into the code. Now that we know that we can actually fall realistically, now we need to set up the conditions that actually make the player fall. Now, in order for us to set up the condition that make the player fall, we're going to have to do a little bit, not actually any math, because remember, we're doing a top-down collisions, and it's very simple. All we have to do is make sure that the player is not in collision with the ground, and then we can start simulating the falling. We only need to set a few conditions here. So let's start simulating the falling. So what condition do we want the player to have the fall? First of all, the player can't be in collision with the ground. So let's start with that. I'm going to put add condition. I'm going to type in player and type in collision. And collision, we're going to put ground. And of course, we're asking if the player is in collision with ground. But what we want to ask is if the player is not in collision with the ground. So we're going to put invert condition. And I'm also going to put another condition because currently our player is Z position is at 0. Not 0, is at 100. So we want to check also if the Z position of the player is not equal to 100. So I'm going to put and. I'm going to put and we're going to put the Z position of the player. Z, I'm going to put elevation is not equal to 100. And here we have it. If the Z position of the player is not equal to 100, we want to trigger this event only once. We want to trigger this only once. And now we want to actually start making the player fall from this. So what we want to do is start changing the maximum fall speed of the player. So I'm going to add an action here. And of course, we have to change the fall simulator's Y position. So I'm going to go into Y, and we want to change the maximum fall speed so it can start falling. So now I'm going to set the maximum fall speed to be equal to 700. Going to put preview. And you'll see that we're already back under. We're back under the ground. And the reason why we're under the ground is because, remember, we set the player's Z position to always be equal to the negative value of the fall simulator. And of course, currently our fall simulator is at 100. So we need to set this to negative 100 so the Z of the player can be equal to 100. It may sound a little bit complicated, but it's not too bad. And now I'm on the ground. I'm going to shorten up the ground a lot so we can actually fall off and see what happens. So I'm going to zoom all the way out. And I'm going to stretch this all the way over here so we can drive off much easier. So I'm going to roll forward by holding W. And let's see what happens if anything happens at all if we fall off. You'll see that currently we're still floating. And that's because we don't want to set it up where the player is only falling. The player is falling if. We want to check if it's equal to 100 first. So I'm going to preview this and see what happens. Let's see if we fall off and start falling again. I'm going to fall off. Let me go all the way to the edge. I'm trying not to go too fast off the edge so we can see what happens. And now we're falling. This is how we're falling. And the reason why it chops a little bit is kind of how Gdevelop 3D is. It's not really used to try to simulate movement like that. But this is the best we have at the moment. So now we have the player actually falling. We have the player actually falling when it falls off of ground. So another thing we want to have is a spring. I forgot to even talk about a spring. We have the falling down pack now. So now we want to have a spring for the player. Because a lot of racing games, they have objects that you can jump onto and you can move up. And they'll boost you upwards. And we also just want to know how to just control the height of the player. Of course, this is where our fall simulator comes in. But before we do this, let's add a spring first. So I'm going to add a new object. I'm going to add a 3D. There's going to be a 3D object so we can see it on the scene since we're doing 3D models and everything. I'm going to type in the 3D box. And this is going to be called spring. Of course, everything can stay default except for these images. I'm going to choose a file. And I'm going to just go quickly and try my best to quickly find my yellow cube that I can use. This is a yellow cube. Of course, you can use whatever you want. You can edit in Piscal. Of course, like always, my Piscal is still broken. But one day we'll get it fixed more than likely. We have the yellow cubes and all of these faces. And we don't really have to show all the faces because all of them won't be seen. But I just like doing it anyway. I'm going to hit apply. And I'm going to drag the spring onto the scene. And currently, if I zoom up, it's really hard to see it. Like, really hard to see it. Because we're really just zoomed out right now. I'm going to try to improve the size of this cube. Of course, now we can see it better. And of course, it's going to be much smaller than this. I'm going to have it by 100 by 100 by 100 pixels. Because it's actually supposed to be small. It's just that we're really zoomed out right now, so it's hard to see it. So I'm going to zoom all the way in. And of course, now we'll be able to see things better. And I'm going to drag this over here. We want it to be pretty close to us. It doesn't really matter where it is. We'll be able to see it. And I'm going to set the Z position as equal to like 10 or something. Because we want it to kind of stick out of the ground. And now that we'll see it'll stick out of the ground. So this is good. Of course, what we want to happen is that when we touch this, it bounces. But of course, we haven't programmed that yet, so it's not going to automatically do it for us. So now, last but not least, we need to program the bounce and resetting the player's position. So let's go into untitled scenes. Of course, the events. I'm going to put Shift A, and now we have a new condition under this. Now, when we are in collision with the spring, we want to do a certain thing. So I'm going to put add condition, player, collision, and if we're in collision with spring, and I'm going to actually copy this, and we want to check if the Z position of the player is equal to 100. I'm going to copy and paste this here, and I'm also going to paste this trigger once as well because we want to do the exact same thing there. If we're in collision with spring and the player's Z position is equal to 100, we want to bounce the player. Now you might be wondering, how are we going to bounce the player? This is where the fall simulator comes in. And I'm going to click into the fall simulator, and the way that we're going to make a fake little bounce is we're going to simply make the player jump. We're going to make this fall simulator jump. So what we want to do for that is we want to simulate a jump key press. Simple as that. Simulate a jump key press. And we want to change the maximum fall speed of the player to be equal 700 after that. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And now the maximum fall speed will be equal to 700. Now we're going to run into a problem when we hit play here. So if I touch it, you see that I start falling downwards. First of all, I start falling downwards when that happened. And another reason why we're falling downwards when we're trying to simulate the jump key is because our player, if we look at this fall simulator, this thing is currently in the air. And of course, this is treating itself like a platformer object. So if it's treating itself like a platformer object and it's in the air, that means it can't jump because it's not in collision with any ground objects. So it can't even jump right now. And when we made it start falling down, that also changed our Z position a bit. But either way, we want to make it so the player is always, this fall simulator is always allowed to jump. So I'm going to go into this always condition here. I'm going to put actions. And I'm going to type in fall simulator, of course. And I'm going to test. I'm going to put allowed jumping again. Basically, jumping is always allowed. And let's see if anything changes. I'm going to go into this. And now we actually bounced off. Now we have an issue. We bounced upwards. A little bit. And then we fell through the ground. And that's because we haven't made a check. But before we make that check, I'm going to go into the fall simulator. If you want to make the bounce higher or just change the physics of the car in general, but if you want to make the bounce higher, what controls the force of a jump is the jump speed. This is what controls the force of a jump. So I'm going to set this to like 1,000 just so it can be much more fun. But now we're going to have a bigger bounce. But what we want to do, and this is the final step, is we want to make it so when we touch the ground again, we want to reset. So I'm going to type in Shift A. And I'm going to put if the player is in collision with ground. Well, this is going to be the reset condition. And actually, I'm going to copy a lot of this here, these conditions that we have here. And we're going to just change a few things about them to match what we're trying to do. So I'm going to copy and paste these. Now we don't want to check if the player is not in collision with ground. We want to check if it is. So we're going to invert the condition again to make it back to normal. And we don't want to check if the Z position of the player is equal to 0. We want to check if it's less than or equal to 0. Because the reason why we don't want to check if it's exactly equal to 0 is because we do that, the player might go past that value of 100, and then it won't execute the code because it went past it because it was moving too fast. So I'm going to put, double click, I'm going to put less than or equal to, and less than or equal to 100. So now we're checking if the player is in collision with the ground, and if the Z position of the player is less than or equal to 100. Now the first thing we want to do is reset the player's Z. And we want to immediately change that Z back to 100. So I'm going to put player, I'm going to type Z, and Z position, the elevation. And we're going to set it back to 100. That's the first thing we want to do. And the second thing we want to do is we want to make that fall simulator, it'll still be falling. So we want to make it stop falling, which means we want to set the falling speed to be equal to 0. So I'm going to add an action, go to fall simulator, and then go into the falling speed. And we're going to change the maximum falling speed to be equal to 0. And also, we want to change the current falling speed to also be equal to 0. because we don't change the current falling speed to be equal to 0, it will just still be falling like normal. So I'm going to go into the fall simulator. Once again, type in falling, and it didn't show up here. Fall simulator, and I'm going to scroll down where it says current falling speed, and I'm going to also set this equal to 0. And last but not least, I want to set the Y position of the fall simulator, because remember, that's kind of our player is following the negative Y position of the fall simulator. So since we want it to be set to 100, the negative value of negative 100 is positive 100. So therefore, we need to set the fall simulator's value to be negative 100. So we're going to add an action. I'm going to go into fall simulator, and then I'm going to type in, of course, I want to type in the Y position. I'm going to go into the Y position of it, and I'm going to set this value to be equal to negative 100. And if we put all this code in correctly, it should snap back after we're on the spring. So I'm going to move forward onto the spring. It's going to bounce up, and then I bounce on the ground. And we can continuously do this forever and ever because the code is flexible, it works. And that's how you make a spring movement and realistic height movements when it comes to your racing game. Now, this will be it for part 2 of the racing game in Gdevelop. If you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure to like, subscribe, comment down below. And if you want another part, you can also comment down below and like the video. You can get part 3 because there's much more to do with this racing game tutorial. We can do drifting and a whole bunch of other features that are commonly in racing games. Once again, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and also consider becoming a member of Q the Game Dev. You'll get notifications always. Of course, you'll always get notifications. You get earlier videos, you'll get priority replies in the comments, you'll get sneak peeks of some of my upcoming projects, and also just helps support the channel in general. So please, if you want to, consider becoming a member of Q the Game Dev. Once again, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next tutorial. See ya.